6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. All right, so hello everyone, welcome back to History of Jackson and welcome to this special D-Day episode with Paul Wordadge from WW2 TV. How you doing, mate?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, happy to be here.
No worries. I'm really glad to welcome you on to talk about D-Day. But I think the first question I want to ask you is what inspired you to become a historian and to be teaching people about D-Day and the Normandy campaigns?
Well, I just kind of became one by accident, really. I mean, I was just interested in the subject myself, and then gradually people started asking me to explain more to them because I was kind of further ahead than they were. And lo and behold, a few years later, I'm a tour guide and historian, but not qualified, not chosen as a career. It just sort of happened, really. Particularly it was with veterans. I would come over to Normandy with veterans, also go to Veterans Association meetings in the UK, and they would know their little part of the war, but often they would not have the contextual understanding of, so what was the rest of the brigade doing or something like that. And I found myself being able to answer some of those questions. They go, oh, and then they'd say, speak to Paul, he knows more about what the other division was doing. So that's sort of how it happened.
I think it's really interesting how you just fell into it. I think a lot of us in history have different routes. It's always really interesting hearing how people get into that. But I think one thing that most people always associate with this campaign is it's just D-Day. So why is it called D-Day, firstly?
Well, I mean, there are lots of D-Days. It's just that the June 1944 Normandy one has come to mean the only one. It's like Hoover meaning vacuum. The brand name has become the term we use. So each day when an amphibious operation or something that was being kept secret, but that was being planned in the future for a certain day, but didn't necessarily know when the day was going to fall, depending on intelligence pictures or weather, they would have that. Well, it's going to be D-Day, the D standing for day, and the H hour, the H standing for the hour it was going to commence at, to be that kind of shorthand. And then you can then count down things before and after it. So if we're going to have an invasion of place X, the bombardment will start on D-5, and then we will have a harbour built by D+5. So D-Day, I always feel sorry for the people involved in other D-Days who, when they talk about D-Day, people assume they mean June the 6th, 1944, but they actually mean another one. So, you know, one veteran I knew used to say, I did 4 D-Days, which is not incorrect, but the wider public would go, what do you mean you did 4 D-Days? You got off and on 4 different landing craft and did 4 different landings on the same day. And you go, no, the others were D-Day as well.
I think you've got a really nice point there, that there are so many different D-Days, but there's also so many different amphibious landings within this one day. I think loads of people have a misconception that it is one set of landing crafts going to one beach and disembarking, and then that's the Normandy campaign.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly people in North America. They often refer to Normandy Beach, and I go beaches, because I don't know quite how that happened. Maybe it's kind of the original movie, like Longest Day, which didn't necessarily convey that there were miles between the beaches and it was different locations. I don't know, but yeah, there are 5 actual landing beaches, and then you have peripheral landings on the side of some of them for commandos. You have Point du Hoc, which is an amphibious assault. Then you have landings on the San Marcouf Islands off Utah Beach, which technically are part of the Utah sector, but they're not Utah Beach. So it kind of gets complicated. Then you have the airborne drop zones and landing zones, which are all also first wave coming ashore, but they're coming in by air. So it can get a bit complicated.
So why did the Allies need this landing and this campaign? Because there's such a lot of man hours going into planning this, but also making sure that it's executed properly.
Well, essentially, everybody recognized once the British and French were pushed out of France in 1940 that the obvious, clear, direct route back to defeating the Third Reich would be kind of the same way you were pushed out, so via France. France has a massive great border with Germany. It's traditionally where invasions back and forth between the French and Germans would go. In terms of the big planning, the amphibious operations in the Mediterranean, which I don't think are in any way insignificant, but they are kind of second level of importance. So really is the fighting in Italy. It's always, the focus is going to be defeating Germany via France. And various people like Churchill and Alan Brooke keep making those claims, even, you know, within hours almost of being pushed out of France in 1940. There's this sense of we will go back into France. And then it just comes down to when and where within France you're going to come.
And those conversations about where you're going to land, when you're going to land, how do they develop? Because France has a massive coastline. There's seemingly thousands of places you can land.
So there are, and then there aren't if you want to maximize your chance of success. So the first thing is to be within the cover of air power, to make sure there's air superiority over the beaches. So that means your invasion beaches are within a short hop in terms of flying from as many air bases in the UK as possible, because people referred to the UK by kind of 1942, 1943 as the world's largest aircraft carrier, which isn't an unfair way of describing it. So you can't go down to certain parts of, for example, the other side, south of Brittany. It goes beyond air cover. You also want to maximize the number of ports you can take your troops from. So if so you've got to think about how many different areas troops can be loaded onto ships and landing craft, and how many, and the routes to get them to France. And then the other big consideration is trying to outwit the Germans, who know we're going to be coming back in. And it's like a big chess game, really, in that the Allies are trying to focus on a plan of where they're going to go, but at the same time develop a plan of deceiving the Germans and make them think we're going to go somewhere else. So in fact, there's three elements: planning the actual operation, keeping that actual operation secret, and then the third one is to then convince the Germans we're doing something else. So there's sort of three operations running in parallel. And in a sense, what the Allies did, this is really kind of dumbing it down in a way, is that they used what they knew about how the Germans worked against them. And the Germans tended to go for a much more logical, analytical, mechanical, the kind of the German cliches. And so the obvious closest route to Germany is the Pas-de-Calais, so right opposite Dover and Folkestone and those places, and 21 miles across the channel. You're not very far away. You clip the corner off France. You're already sort of on the way towards Germany. And that's where the Romans had thought about crossing, and in fact did cross. It's where Napoleon had thought about it. It's where Hitler himself thought about it, Operation Sea Lion in 1940. So it's much better to try and convince someone something they already want to believe. And so I'm going to rather pathetically compare to the Germans to like little children and Father Christmas. It's not very difficult to persuade a 3-year-old that Father Christmas is real, because they absolutely want the whole idea of Santa giving them a present and tooth fairies to be true. So the Germans will always sort of default to thinking, well, they're bound to come that way because it's the obvious way. So when the Allies chose Normandy, it's less obvious. It's still an absolute possibility, but it's not the top possibility. So then that way, you're essentially feeding the Germans information that they would be inclined to believe anyway, reinforce what they already think, as opposed to trying to convince them something else. So I always think that's probably the single biggest reason why Normandy was chosen, is that it's not the top obvious location. It's only second. That said, people like Rommel and other German generals had the sneaking suspicion that the Allies wouldn't be so obvious as to come to the obvious place, because it is too obvious. So it's like a chess game. It's like this dynamic of bluff and counter bluff, and everybody's trying to think 5 or 6 moves ahead and trying to predict what the other side is doing. So it gets complicated.
Certainly in all my readings of what's going on, I'm like, there must have been so much, anguish, anxiety about this kind of chess game, but there's also a chess game going off internally within the Allies as well. How unified in their thinking are the political and military leaders of the Allied forces at this point?
Well, we could go off and talk about that for 2 or 3 hours and still not unravel it. I mean, they're more or less in line with some differences, and it's more about when is more of the debate, in that there are some Americans who are wanting to push for the Second Front to be started in 1943. Churchill, for example, is adamant that we're not ready yet, and indeed some Americans of that opinion. And it's about, I suppose it comes down to risk and reward. Okay, the Americans have more production, they have more spare divisions, if you like, spare things, so they can afford in some ways to have 2 or 3 goes at something, and even if the first one doesn't work, just kind of rearm and do a second one. But the British and the Commonwealth, the Canadians, they can't really do that. They're running short of manpower, they're running short of everything. So it's like when we go in and start the Second Front in France, it absolutely must be successful on that first day. We can't just, oh well, we'll try again, like an FA Cup final replay. You can't just, oh well, we'll try next Saturday. That's not going to be the case. So there's slight deliberations about that. British also and the Commonwealth are thinking about the Mediterranean. France is thinking about the Mediterranean, North Africa, which technically has already been liberated, most of North Africa. But there's those kind of considerations of future post-war ambitions. And there's also this idea of how far will the Soviets push when they push west. So there's various considerations, but the Allies are mostly aligned by the beginning of 1944, and part of that is even down just to the selection of Eisenhower as supreme commander, who is going to be the kind of person who can smooth out any lingering differences. For me, the time when the American-British relationship was the most strained in terms of amphibious landings and politically was Operation Torch, a year earlier in North Africa. That's when, Churchill's thinking about, say, post-war and empire and Mediterranean, Suez Canal, and Americans don't necessarily think about those things. They're more about defeating the Germans and defeating the Italians. So that was probably, for me, the low point in terms of people like General Marshall and Alan Brooke and those people who aren't FDR and Churchill. But really, by 1944, the Allies are in harmony. And if they're not in harmony, they are absolutely in harmony when you compare them to the Germans. So that when people talk about the cracks that are in the Allied command and relationships, and of course there are cracks and little disagreements, and there's going to be other moments later on in the war, Market Garden and the Ardennes. But the Germans have chasms in their high command. They can't even agree in principle on what to do about a forthcoming invasion, whereas the Allies at least know that get a bridgehead, push inland. So it can be easy to look at what's not quite perfect about the Allies and go, well, it's not perfect. Yeah, but it's pretty damn good, though.
No, and I think that's something that we often ignore, focusing on the Allied part of the D-Day, but not looking at what the Germans are doing, how the Germans are reacting. But another part that we tend to forget is the very beginning of D-Day. We tend to only really think about these landings on the beaches, the men coming off the beaches. How does it actually begin before they start going towards the beach?
Well, it depends on your parameters in some ways of when the operation actually begins, because there are these pre-invasion things that must take place. The infamous transportation plan, the peak of which was sort of March and April, where the Allies are doing their best to bomb the railheads and the rail yards and the bridges to limit the German potential to counterattack towards. At this point, the Germans don't know where the invasion is going to be. So the Allies are hitting all the railway yards in kind of France and Belgium and Netherlands to limit the Germans pushing anywhere near the coast. Because if they were in April just bombing the rail yards inland from the Normandy beaches, the Germans go, hello, why are they only bombing that bit? So that begins months earlier. You've got the science in terms of determining the suitability of landing beaches. That begins months, arguably years earlier. So the surveying of how do the tides work, what will the sand do, sending in the combined operations pilotage parties in advance to get out of submarines and things like that, and little dinghies and stuff, and go and assess the terrain, assess the sand. You've got the people being smuggled out of France with information about the defenses. You've got the use of the aerial reconnaissance, which begins 2 or 3 years in advance of June the 6th. You've got the British government request for photos of the coastlines of France, and that begins years before D-Day. So if you want to be kind of pedantic about it, you can't even really give a date for when it begins, because all of these things are part of that build-up. And that's not counting the actual training of troops to be ready for a second front whenever it goes. And a unit like the American 29th Division, which is one of the first American units in the UK, they're there from sort of 43 and 43, and they're basically continuously training for an operation they haven't even been told what and when it's going to be, but it clearly is going to be an amphibious assault. So that begins way in advance. So, you know, you could go off on a tangent about, so what's the date it starts? Well, you know, it depends on your parameters.
It's really interesting to hear how the British government are trying to get all this information through photographs, sand samples, like things that we wouldn't traditionally think of as being part of that beginning of that invasion are actually crucial. But then you mentioned something really, really interesting I wanted to pull apart there. You were speaking about those American soldiers being in Britain training for an invasion that they didn't know when it was going to happen and what it was going to happen, where it was going to happen, but it was an amphibious assault. Once these soldiers start to get the idea, well, we're going to be part of an amphibious assault now, how do they feel? How do they understand that this is going to go ahead?
I mean, it depends on how individual units decide to explain it to their men, because there's no rules. Some would be, well, you don't need to know anything until we tell you what to know. Others would kind of play it with, there's something really big coming in and up, and this is going to be really important, and we're working towards that. It's the leadership styles of different divisions, and then within that the different armies is very telling. You know, the Polish armored division, who don't come ashore till a few weeks after D-Day, for example, they can't wait to get in and start taking some revenge. So no need to motivate them. Their struggle is going to be to just keep them all contained and not get too excited, whereas other units are feeling very much that they've done their bit, and that doesn't mean that they're in any way cowardly or they don't want to be part of the war effort. But units like the British 50th Division that have been all the way through, you know, North Africa, Sicily, and things like that, they're seeing all these units in the UK, in the pubs, in the streets, that haven't been deployed at all yet, and they're thinking, so why are we training for an amphibious assault? Why have we got to go first? How and where and when and in what manner they are told about it varies distinctly. What is definitely underlying it all is this inherent belief that this is the big one, this is the one that it all matters, and hence why Overlord has, well, let's call it a year and a half of planning. We've got to say something. And what's interesting is that's D-Day, Overlord, Normandy is the exception to the rule. The other amphibious landings, Torch in North Africa, Husky in Sicily, Avalanche, so you can move into Salerno and Anzio in Italy. They're sort of planned on the back of a fag packet in the pub over 20 minutes. I mean, I'm being really, really facetious about that, but they aren't given anything like the thorough bottom to top, doubling your everything and making sure that you've stacked the deck essentially. And I use that figuratively and literally. I mean, there are literally men stacked up on the decks of the ships coming over for D-Day, but when the Allies are making sure that every single tiny 0.1% advantage that they can give the Allied soldiers, they're going to do, because of this expectancy and acceptance that it has to work. It will absolutely have to work. It is going to work. And it's going to be the single biggest and most, well, not biggest, because there are different ways of breaking it down, but Husky in Sicily in some ways is bigger than Normandy, and Okinawa in the Pacific is bigger. It depends whether you're counting ships or personnel or bombardment ships, but there are different ways of working out the scores. But Overlord certainly isn't substantially larger than anything else. It's large, but it's the kind of thing the Allies are putting together. But yeah, the Allies are aware that there's a is a pressure, I suppose, on making sure it works.
So speaking of, making sure it works, you can do all of that planning, that year and a half planning. You can, check the soil, you can do your reconnaissance, but it does all come down to, having played sports for so many years, it does all come down to the day. So when they land, how do they set about making sure that that's going to be the success that they need it to be?
Volume, just sheer quantity, just numbers of aircraft, numbers of ship, numbers of waves coming ashore. And this is where you get into when I'm with a group in Normandy, I say sometimes you have to wear your analytical hat, and other times you have to wear your emotional hat, because I've been with many first wave and second wave D-Day beach veterans, whether it's Omaha Gold Sword, who felt that they were on their own pretty much when that first landing craft ramp comes down. And yes, they had felt in the channel like they're part of this armada of 5,500 ships, etc., etc. But when you're actually chugging your way on those last couple of miles, let's take Omaha. Omaha is 4.5 miles long, and the first wave of landing craft is 60. So spread 60, that means it's 15 per mile, which means there's actually hundreds of yards between you and the next landing craft, which you probably can't see because of the smoke and the fog and things that morning. So you're chugging your way ashore thinking, good, it's just me and Jim. It's just me, Jim, and Fred here. And how are we going to do that? But that's not really what's going on. Behind it is this juggernaut, this conveyor belt that is going to keep putting stuff at that beach. We often look at it from the wrong point of view. Living in France as I do, there are lots of magazines and books about the Atlantic Wall, the much vaunted Atlantic Wall, and they have pictures of and there were this fearsome 88mm gun at this end of Omaha Beach and another 88mm gun at the other end of the beach, forgetting that there are like 90 naval guns of 5-inch and above bombarding Omaha Beach alone. So yeah, there are 2 88mm guns in Omaha, but there's 50 times that coming in, and that's just naval power. That's not the air power. That's not the firepower from the tanks coming ashore. So yeah, the guys coming ashore first absolutely felt very isolated, and they would have absolutely felt that it was a high risk thing. But from my point of view as a historian, D-Day was really, really, really unlikely to go wrong. So many things would have had to have gone wrong that you take it into beyond the realms of mathematical possibility for all the naval bombardment to miss and the aerial bombardment to miss and the troops to be in the wrong place and for all of that to have failed would be not impossible, but really unlikely. For me, the risk is 4 or 5 days later, because then it's about who's going to bring up their reinforcements first. Because the Germans don't have to cross any sea to bring their reinforcements up. And by reinforcements, we're particularly meaning tank divisions. And they can bring something like 5 or 6, depending on which ones they decide to release from elsewhere. Theoretically, 5 or 6 armor divisions, including SS ones, could arrive within 3, 4, 5 days of the first day of the invasion. The Allies have double that in terms of armor divisions in the UK, but it's getting them across. And it takes 2 or 3 days to bring an armor division across when you consider you've got to bring across enough fuel for it to operate and to be on the offensive, bring ashore enough ammunition. And so it's those next few days is will we expand the beachheads? Will we link the beachheads? Will we be able to make enough space just inland of the beaches to bring all our aircraft over and have as many airfields built as we want? All that aspect. So that's where the risk to some extent comes in, except that once you've got that foothold, very unlikely to lose it again. Even Anzio in Italy, which was a really problematic beachhead for weeks after the first day ashore. And yeah, there was a problem with a lack of aggression amongst some of the commanders, and the Germans encircled it and armor divisions, but there was never a doubt that the beachhead was going to hold. No way would the Germans have pushed the Allies back into the sea. It would just limit how fast they move. And that very, very few in history amphibious landings have actually fail to get that hold on the first day. Now, that doesn't mean they don't come with a lot of loss of life. Tarawa, Peleliu in the Pacific. But the chances of it actually not working and the Allies limping back in the sea and trying to kind of catch a lift on, you know, a passing fishing boat, that's just not going to happen.
And I think you've addressed the misconception that a lot of people have, is that there was a likely chance of failure around these landings, and that the Germans did have the possibility of repelling this and sending the Allies back into the sea. Then you are faced with this question of, how do the Germans react to such a big landing? Because, as we said earlier, they're expecting it to be where they expect it. They're believing Santa Claus is turning up. So how are they responding to this?
Well, badly. It's the simple answer to that. I mean, there were two rival schools of thought within the Third Reich about how to stop the Second Front when it comes. And they are basically, don't let them get in the front door. Just simply keep that door closed, which is Rommel's suggestion. So just put everything you can on the beaches, landmines, obstacles, barbed wire, tank divisions scattered behind the beaches, the likely beaches, as many infantry, as many guns, many mortars there, and don't let them get in the door. The other theory, which is more von Rundstedt, is let them get the beachhead, let them get inland, let them get their supply lines extended, and then kind of encircle them, sort of the Napoleon into Russia, Germans into Russia, Soviet Union type method. And when people say to me, so which is the best of those? I go, doesn't really matter. You've got to just pick one and bloody well go with it. And what happens is the Germans can't decide which is the best theory. And I'm doing this in a kind of a jokey way, but like Rommel sees Hitler in the morning and says, right, we mustn't let them get on the beaches. And Hitler goes, yes, no, absolutely. Well done, Erwin. Perfect. Von Rundstedt sees him in the afternoon, outlines a plan for, no, what we've got to do is let them get in, let them get, let have the tanks inland and reserve, and then smash them then. And Hitler goes, yeah, that's good. And at the heart of this is Hitler doesn't know who to trust, because von Rundstedt is sort of the old school, you know, he's not a young guy, but he hasn't ever been defeated. So in Rommel's, in Hitler's eyes, von Rundstedt has a 100% record. Rommel had his ass kicked in Tunisia and North Africa barely a year and a half before. Now people would say, well, yeah, but he did really well before that. Well, yeah, maybe, but he did leave with his tail between his legs, ill, in fact, didn't even see the last bit when von Armin actually sees the destruction of the German Panzer Army in North Africa and Tunisia. So Hitler can't decide. It's like, do I go with the guy who seems to be better? Rommel seems to be the guy that has the tactical nous, but he has been kicked out of North Africa. Or do I go with von Rundstedt, who's got this unblemished record? The mistake he makes, and by the way, I'm laughing because I'm really grateful he did make that mistake, is he couldn't decide. And basically he goes into a casino, puts $50 on black and $50 on red, and ends up losing half his money, because you've got to just decide. And the German command is all, no one quite knows who their responsibility is. I mean, I don't know how to make an analogy. Like you've got a modern city that's divided into blocks like the Americans have, right? And it should be, right, this fire department has this quarter, this fire department has this quarter, and everybody knows what they're trying to protect. But the Third Reich way is, well, on a Tuesday, you'll be in charge of this bit, but you have to defer to this guy, because to go down that street, you have to check with the owner of that there, because he's got to give you the say on that. And no one really knows who they have to really consult, even if do they have autonomy? Do they have the right to make their own decisions? The Allies, it's very clear cut. Within the hierarchy of the Allies, everybody knows where their responsibilities begin and end. Some people are a bit pissed off about it. People are senior to other people and think they should be further up or further, but they understand it, and they understand what they're allowed to do on their own terms. If you're a command of an Allied tank division, to some extent, if you see an opportunity, you can kind of go for it. You haven't got, oh, well, I better make a call, you know, and check. But the Germans are very much stuck in this, we have to make a call. And it shows itself on D-Day with, for example, the 21st Panzer Division, the only armored division that's really close to a landing beach. It is close to Sword Beach, sort of towards near Juneau as well, and the airborne sector. And the commanding officer, Feuchting, is in Paris with his girlfriend. And that morning, and they can't get in touch with him. And rather than just doing something, regimental commanders kind of sit on their asses for hours going, well, he'll turn up. He'll ring at some point. Because, and I'm kind of joking about it, but the fear of being punished for doing the wrong thing hangs over a German commander's head more than the fear of doing nothing at all. If you haven't been told to do anything and you don't do anything, that's your, well, I wasn't told to do anything, which is the reverse, but the same logic of the Germans when they are in the war crimes trials saying, well, I was just obeying orders. It's the counterpoint of that. If you're being told to send trains to a death camp, that's following orders. But if you haven't been told to push your armored division towards a beachhead, that's also an order. It's a negative. It's the opposite of an order, but you haven't been told to do anything. So the Germans are very much caught up in this permission orders.
It does kind of highlight the German structures which have plagued or safeguarded Hitler's position throughout the 30s and the early 40s. But also, as you said, leads to their kind of defeat. We were just mentioning about German command structures being all splintered, not listening to Rommel, or kind of partially listening to Rommel as well. But then when the attacks come in and they're establishing the beachhead, the Allies are establishing the beachhead and establishing themselves in France. Some of the Germans going, well, I didn't have an order, so I didn't do anything. How are they being able to establish themselves and being ready to push on through France towards Germany?
How are the Allies able to establish themselves? Well, there is a plan that has been put by Montgomery with phase lines, which was done weeks earlier, which people use as a sort of stick to beat him, or they use as a means of praising him, because at the end of the Normandy campaign, the Allies come out under schedule. They planned 90 days, and it ended up being 77 days. But other people say, well, it was very slow at the beginning. But it was a projection. You can't possibly predict 27 moves ahead. If we go back to the chess analogy, they're pretty certain that D-Day, the Germans will do this, this, and this near the beachheads. That's okay, because we'll do this, this, and this. But 2 weeks later, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, which divisions are going to turn up? Which area they're going to go into? What's the weather going to be like? How are divisions going to adapt to the post D-Day climate? Because one of the things that became a weird issue was that the units that have been focusing on getting out the landing craft successfully took a bit of time to kind of relearn the broad concept of fighting. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, for example, who scaled the cliffs there, ended up later in June kind of guarding prisoners of war up on the Utah coast. It's like at the beginning of the day, they kind of go, where's our cliff? We need to start with a cliff. We don't do war unless we can start with a cliff. I mean, I'm being facetious, but there's this idea that they have been trained for a very specific task, and the men in the British 3rd Division, Canadian 3rd Division had spent months either jumping out of real landing craft in real mock invasions, or running out of wooden or fake ones, or even just bits of like string marked out on the ground in the shape of a landing craft, and then upon exit, Sergeant Smith goes off this way with this team and Sergeant Johnson goes off that way. And when that all worked okay, they've then got to, in the field whilst facing the enemy, go back to regular infantry and field work, which they hadn't been neglecting, but there had been this absolute focus on getting ashore. And so it took these units a bit of while to adapt to the changing face of battle, because D-Day had relied on a bit of muscle memory to an extent of everything going to routine, but you don't get that when you're fighting the Americans in the bocage towards Saint-Lô, or the British pushing towards Caen and not knowing, so which bit are the Germans going to be defending? The intelligence picture they had for the beaches didn't apply to some extent the next few days, because the Germans in their battle groups, these improvised Kampfen groups, would just occupy a village that the British didn't necessarily think would be the one they would. Well, why are they doing that one? That's not really the one I would do. So there's lots of that in the next few days, reassessment of what is expected. And it's part of the reason why the beachhead doesn't expand quite at the rate the most optimistic people had hoped for, because there was an uncertainty about what was ahead.
And I can certainly understand the muscle memory playing into that as well. You know, especially if you've trained for something for so long, there's definitely a difficulty in unlearning those behaviors. Once this has been a success, you know, those 77 days have come in under budget. How is the news relayed back to the publics in Britain, the rest of the Commonwealth, Canada, and the US?
Well, in some ways, the public saw a greater victory than there really was. I mean, there was a great victory. I mean, the Normandy campaign was absolutely successful, but the Falaise campaign, the Falaise pocket, the last week or so, the Germans shat the bed, basically, in terms of how to organize a withdrawal, and had got themselves in their own stupid counterattack towards Avranches and got themselves in a complete pickle. One of the stupidest counterattacks ever made in military history is von Kluge's attempt to try and cut Patton's Third Army going down to Brittany and kind of get to the point of Avranches and blah, blah, blah. So the Germans found themselves having to get the hell out of Dodge and left behind, you know, 3/4 of their armored vehicles and stuff like that. So that last week of the Normandy campaign was the Allies being very good at what they had been getting better at over the what we call the attritional phase. The Normandy campaign is beachhead, attrition, breakout. That's how I define it, and other historians do. And the attritional phase got a bit stuck and things weren't progressing quite with the speed. But in the end, the Falaise Gap was a complete unmitigated disaster for the Germans. Even those that say, yeah, but they got some men out, they got some divisions out. Yeah, but the army was broken. To continue where I was going to go with this is that the news of the encirclement of a German army, the great British public, the American public, they want it over by Christmas now. They want it. It's like, and people go, well, actually, no, we've still got the rest of France to go. We've still got Belgium, Netherlands, Germany. There's that big river called the Rhine we're going to have to get across at some point. There's a little bit of an urgency accepted and expected from the public as, well, come on then, you know, let's get more, which sort of leads you to the risk of Operation Market Garden, which sort of goes against the Allied plan of just steady. Let's just keep on pushing the boulder closer and closer that we've got cranking, the boulder that's rolling slowly towards Germany. Let's be bold. Let's try something ambitious. And you also have to anticipate that the Allies had a hell of a good, thorough knowledge of the weather. I mean, the understanding of the weather is part of the success of Operation Overlord, is knowing that the storm that had been raging was going to clear and was going to give them the window to come ashore on June the 6th, and Group Captain Stagg, the meteorologist, and all that. But that same weather expertise is also telling them there's a really shit winter coming. The worst winter of the 20th century, 1944, 1945. So it's like, if this all snarls up to mud and snow and ice, and they looked at what happened to German movements in Barbarossa and pushing in towards Moscow, is that maybe we can get it all done before Christmas, which now seems pie in the sky. It seems, well, no way. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of fighting to go. But I think the public perception and the commanders, if you've got a string of victories, you're feeling on top of the world. And the Allied commanders come out of Normandy generally feeling that they had adapted well. They had got themselves together. Let's do more of it. Let's do that. I mean, by September 1944, when elements of Patton's Third Army are still fighting for the Channel ports or the French ports in Brittany, places like Saint-Malo and Brest, the other half of Patton's Third Army is knocking on the door of the Rhine across to the east of France. I mean, the army spans almost the entire width of France at that point. So it's like, well, hang on, we're nearly there. But you look at the way the Rhine winds its way down, and you've got to get an entire army across the Rhine, not one little probing thing. So it does lead to a bit of expectation on the part of the public to, come on, victory then, come on, which we now realize wasn't going to be possible for another 11 months is what we're talking about, from June the 6th to the victory.
Does that kind of play into the legacy of the Normandy campaign, and that people kind of seeing it as a bigger victory than it perhaps was at that time?
I think so. I mean, the legacy of Normandy is it's probably the most understood and the most misunderstood battle of World War II. I mean, the number of books on it, the number of documentaries and TV shows and video games, is that people do think they have a grasp on it, and then they don't necessarily sit it in the contextual understanding of what's happening in the rest of the world and what's happening with the Soviets pushing east or pushing west from the east and things like that. So I think certainly there's a clientele who come to take Normandy tours who sort of think that it goes Normandy and then skips straight to VE Day, and you go, well, no, not really. I mean, there's a hell of a lot in between, and downs as well as ups. I mean, the graph is absolutely moving closer and closer to the defeat of the Third Reich. But on that slope, there are these big crushing moments where it looks like it's all going the other way. The first few hours of the German offensive into the Ardennes, things like that. The Hurtgen Forest in October and November for the Americans, the Market Garden for the British. And so it's by no means a smooth journey. It's going the right way, but there are these big blips along the way.
I think that's always something that struck me when we look at World War II and we see these programs, that it does kind of go D-Day, VE Day, with very little coverage of what's going off between as well. So it's really nice for you to give that.
It's because D-Day, and I'm specifying just June the 6th. If you just look at June the 6th, it's a very neat package to take on board. At the beginning of the day, the Germans held the beaches, and at the end of the day, the Allies held the beaches. It's you can wrap it up like that, and you can then go and see a cemetery where the men fell on that day. And sometimes it's a thing that happens to people, visitors to Normandy, is they are surprised that the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach has graves going right up to, months later, and that the British cemeteries and Canadian cemeteries similarly have dates. There's this sense. In fact, an American politician, one of the big names, I forget who it was, a VP or something a few years ago, said that he had paid his respects at the cemetery where full of I saw the graves of all those men who died on D-Day. And people pointed out, like myself, yes, and the thousands of others who died in the days after D-Day. But in his mind, or in his PR team's mind, he kind of got this idea that was the D-Day dead. And yes, some of the D-Day dead are there, but not just that. So I think June the 6th is a nice, easy, like the Second Battle of Alamein works the same way. Stalingrad works the same way. Most of those big epic battles, you can kind of go, well, that's it. There's the victory. And you go away at that. Whereas, when does the Battle of Normandy even end, for example? And that sounds a stupid question, but even amongst my friends in Normandy, we disagree. Because Le Havre, which is absolutely part of the geographic region of Normandy, wasn't liberated until September. But most people in writing about Normandy say the closure of the Falaise pocket, August 22nd, 23rd, is the end of the Normandy campaign, and especially because you liberate Paris 2 days later, and Paris is miles away from Normandy. At that point, people think, well, we've done Normandy. Well, no, there's still Le Havre. Le Havre is still part of Normandy. So back to your earlier point about when does it start? How far out to sea, for example, is someone killed with the Navy? Is their death counted as a Normandy casualty? If you're killed on a minesweeper in the middle of the Channel, is before D-Day, is that part of D-Day, or is that part of the Navy campaign? And the argument is it's both and neither, depending on where you put your parameters in. So we can't even agree on the end of the Battle of Normandy. For me, the closure of the Falaise Gap, which leads to the liberation of Paris, is the chapter break. That's, if I was doing a trilogy of films, that's where I would end maybe part 1 or part 2 of the trilogy, because it seems the right point to then pick up the story in the next film. I haven't got a trilogy planned on the Normandy invasion. If anyone's listening to this who wants to give me the money, I'll happily draw one up for you. But it stubbornly isn't the liberation of Normandy because of Le Havre. And Brittany, and then you get the Channel Islands, which aren't, of course, they're not part of Normandy, but they sit just off the coast of Normandy. They're not liberated till May 45. They watch the Allies go past them and then go, shit, they're not coming. So that's, You know, Guernsey is, well, Alderney is just like whatever it is, 15 miles from Cherbourg or something. So it's not Normandy, but it's in the area. That doesn't see liberation for 11 months. So these ideas of dates, the minute you start getting someone going, yeah, but hang on, you can go down massive great rabbit holes. Go, oh yeah, you're right. That makes it complicated.
I think that's the perfect historian's answer to that question as well.
Yeah.
I really like that. But I think that's a nice point now, mate, to then ask you final fun questions we do for every guest here on the podcast. So on World War II TV and all your work, you've covered such a huge area of World War II history. But is there a question that you haven't got an answer to that you desperately would like an answer to?
I mean, I suppose on a kind of a human level is, despite the number of veterans I've spoken to, is what actually makes a guy jump out of a C-47 into enemy flak? What makes a guy from the cop parties get out of that little vessel and creep up in the middle of the night with a satchel full of maps and test tubes to go onto a beach to check it's okay for an invasion coming down the line? That, you know, and sometimes I can, you know, barely motivate myself to answer my emails, and you're getting people who are able to do that kind of thing. So that's sort of the human aspect of what did these, you know, a bomber command crew, an 8th Air Force crew getting into a bomber in the middle part of the war when the losses were horrendous, and you're kind of having to fight the odds. You're going, okay, there's even if it's a 1 in 2 chance of me coming back, would any of us bet our life savings? I don't have any life savings on a 1 in 2 bet on a toss of a coin. No, we wouldn't. We'd want to be a 99% chance before we'd gamble. People gambled their lives on ridiculously low odds. So that's the first one. And I think the other one, much more serious, which I can't get my head round, is why the Third Reich, the Nazis, when they're losing the war, they are being pushed out of everywhere they have been. They are failing to get enough tanks, men, aircraft, fuel. They are still fervently going about the final solution to murder the people that they don't think should be part of the Third Reich. And that just makes no sense to me on a human level, but on a military level. You know, you mean the tracks built up to Auschwitz II were built to deal with Hungary's Jews really late in the war, and you're thinking, put your resources into getting more tanks to the front or something. That I'd kind of like to go back in time to the German high command and say, what were you thinking? Why did you double down on the shitty part of this, the ideological part of it? The older I get, the more that makes no sense to me. Is that you're driving your empire into the ground based on a principle of murdering people who don't fit to your ideal. That, even just saying it like that, the fact it happened, I can't believe it happened. I can't believe they had got themselves to that point, doubling down on their insane, you know, ideological aspirations, I suppose you'd call it.
Yeah, no, I think they're two really, really nice answers, and particularly on the second one, when you look at the sources about what's going off in the camps, you look at the sources of, you know, SAS soldiers responding to what they're seeing in the camps. It is very much what on earth were you thinking? The SAS are just by your gate, the army is just by your gate, and yet you are still killing people in their thousands. Yeah.
I mean, back to Paris again. I mean, that one of the last trains to leave Paris before it fell to the Allies was resistance people from prisons and deportees to take them off to camps. And they actually as if I remember correctly, they turfed off wounded NCOs and officers from the Normandy fighting who could have been taken back to Germany to be patched up, made better, to go back and lead units again and try and stave off defeat. Those guys get left to the Allies, but they are still adamant on getting out people who are enemies of the Third Reich and murdering them. You just go, just what the hell? What are you doing? And how up until like 10, 15 years before, Germany was as normal as the other countries in Europe, whatever normal means. And suddenly the vast part of the populace has just got caught up in this insane idea of a ranting loon, and they're prepared to see their own country be crushed rather than kind of try and do a U-turn and actually kind of come out of it. I mean, good for the Allies to enable them to get the defeat done a bit quicker. Tragic for those that were victims of the Third Reich in the last year, when, you know, it makes no sense to me.
No, I totally agree with that. But then if people want to learn more about those areas of World War II and some of your work on Normandy, where can people go?
Well, there's lots of resources these days, and you know, that one of the things I think is happening with modern writing about the war is they're looking at the broad picture. Indy Neidell of World War II and the Great War series says nothing happens in a vacuum. So where in the past people were just writing about the Normandy campaign or the Italian campaign, what seems to be happening, people like Jonathan Fennell and John Parshall's new book on 1942 that's coming out next year, they're trying to look at that contextual idea of so how is the policy of the murder of more non-Aryan Jewish people, how is that affecting the logistics at the front? How is that affecting the use of trains? So I think my advice is going to look at the modern scholarship, look at what the people are doing, you know, not just YouTube channels, but podcasts and books about tying it all together, and sort of don't just think about Normandy as Normandy, but think about Normandy as part of this wider picture of what's happening in the Third Reich, what's happening in the geopolitical situation. You know, I had an autistic kid on a tour years ago in Normandy. He was like 12 years old. You know, incredible memory. He quoted to me the exact makeup of Zimmerit, the anti-magnetic kind of paste that the Germans put on their armored vehicles. And whatever it is, it's 17% zinc, 60% wood shavings. He knew it exactly. One of those things he'd remembered. And he said to me, and he had one question. He didn't really want to make much contact, didn't make much eye contact. And he had one question. He kind of took a day and a half to get the courage to ask me. And his question was, did the victory in Normandy ensure the defeat of the Third Reich, or would the Third Reich have been defeated anyway? And I thought about it. Okay, that's a really good question that you've worded really well, because as much as I love Normandy, as much as I like telling the stories of those who fought in Normandy, the defeat of the Third Reich was going to happen by that point. It would have taken longer, but the Allies are pushing up through Italy. The Soviets are pushing them from the east. They're running out of aircraft. They're running out of this. The defeat was on the cards. And what I responded to this kid was, I said, what it did do was ensure that more of Western Europe was able to continue their country's existence as a democracy after VE-Day than if the Allies hadn't. Because if the Allies hadn't gone to Normandy, then we can only assume the Soviets would have gone further west. You know, we know that they already, you know, ended up with Romania and Hungary and Poland and half of Germany. But when would they have stopped? Would they have stopped? How many more countries would have been in peril in those post-war periods? So D-Day was necessary, but it was necessary for multiple reasons, none of which are less important than the others, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
I totally agree with that. I think, you know, that point, you can see it with Churchill and Roosevelt, or more Churchill, with their post-war planning, trying to plan around what Russians might do and what Stalin might do. So you can certainly see that planning in there. But then if people want to keep up to date with you and World War II,
just check my channel. Yeah, World War II TV. Just go to the YouTube channel, and all the future live streams are listed there. One thing that gets a bit confusing, because everything I do is live, is that if you're looking for under the videos category, there's very little there, because I do very little uploaded pre-recorded content. Everything is live. You have to hit the live category for all the things to come up that I've just done and are doing later on. And I've done 1,700 live streams in 5 years now, which is just stupid, I think is the word. I thought at one point I might get to 100, and here we are, 1,700. I'll hit 2,000 sometime next year, which is just crazy.
That's ridiculous. Well,
yeah.
Insane. Well, thank you very much for coming on, mate. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoy talking about this stuff, as you can probably tell.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6,
History with Jackson podcast.